On April 9, 1914, 1 month after the destruction of the tent colony at Forbes, and just 11 days before the destruction of the tent colony at Ludlow, a whaleboat from the U.S. Navy gunboat Dolphin, stationed in the Panuco River off the coast of Tampico, Mexico, ferried 9 unarmed sailors ashore on a gasoline run. The source of the gasoline was a German civilian named Max Tiron, who happened to have some canisters in a warehouse in northeast Tampico. In a city normally awash with petroleum, it was now nearly impossible to find fuel, as most refinery operations were shut down in anticipation of rebel attacks. Mexico at this time was a little over a month into the fledgling dictatorship of General Victoriano Huerta, who had just seized power from the liberal reformer Francisco Madero, who himself had toppled the 3-decade reign of President for Life Porfirio Diaz just 2 years before that. You may recall from episode 5 that Francisco Madero had been backed by American interests close to John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Corporation, who wanted to win back Mexican petroleum contracts from the British company El Águila, the Eagle, which had been granted an effective monopoly in Mexico by the Diaz regime. Once in office, Madero took a staunch antitrust stance, which was reported on enthusiastically in the American press, while his intermediaries behind the scenes quietly took a more selective and nuanced line on what did and did not qualify as a monopoly. El Águila was out, and Standard Oil was in, a rich irony given that Standard Oil was in the process of being broken up for violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Standard Oil got 10 years of tax-free operation in Mexico and eminent domain as needed for pipelines, ports, roads, and railways. A true sweetheart deal. But the Eagle was not the only company that found itself out in the cold after the Diaz regime fell. Francisco Madero came from one of Mexico's richest families whose holdings included significant capital in cotton, timber, cane sugar, cattle, coal, iron, rubber, and copper. One major competitor in the copper trade was the Guggenheim family of Philadelphia and New York, who, before they were famous for things like endowing iconic museums and going down with the Titanic, controlled the world's largest copper mining and smelting empire, an empire they continued to grow by using access to their Latin American smelting operations to collect rents from other copper miners and as a bargaining chip in acquiring new mines. The Madero family had a copper smelter in Torreon, which had been embargoed under the Diaz regime, but with Diaz's ouster in May 1911, it was again operating freely and was worth real money, a perfect jewel for the Guggenheim's imperial crown. The Maderos had in fact come close to selling the smelter to the Guggenheims late in the Diaz regime, but with Francisco now in power and their political fortunes now reversed, the old price was no longer right. The Maderos declined the sale, forcing the Guggenheims to turn to friends in high places. Half a dozen years earlier, during the administration of Teddy Roosevelt, when mining baron Simon Guggenheim teamed up with J.P. Morgan to make a play for Alaska's copper, coal, petroleum, and fisheries under the aegis of the Alaska Syndicate, he found a kindred spirit in one Richard Achilles Ballinger, who at the time was commissioner of the Bureau of Land Management of its day, known then as the General Land Office. The Alaska Syndicate had a specific interest in a portfolio of coal claims in the Bering River Basin collected by a mining engineer named Clarence Cunningham, who the syndicate hoped it would not become widely known was secretly and illegally working on their behalf. Surveys estimated the Cunningham claims contained as much as 90 million tons of coal. In 1907, the Alaska Syndicate contracted with Cunningham to buy his Alaska coal at a fixed price of $2.25 a ton for 25 years, to be finalized as soon as the claims were cleared by the General Land Office. The retail price of coal in 1907 was about $12 a ton, making the syndicate's potential profit per ton a tidy $9.75. Even if they got only half of the estimated coal out of the ground in those 25 years, they might clear up to $500 million in profit, over $15 billion in today's money. But merely contracting for the coal was not sufficient to be granted mining rights. A claimant also needed to be granted a patent by the General Land Office, and that proposition had just become a lot more fraught in 1906 when Teddy Roosevelt put all unpatented coal in Alaska into the public domain. When the Cunningham claims came up for review, they were investigated by agents of the Land Office for possible fraud. But after 19 days, Commissioner Ballinger suspended the investigation and ordered that the claims be clear-listed and the patents be issued on an expedited basis. By this time, a land office agent named Louis Glavis had found evidence that Clarence Cunningham was in collusion with the Alaska Syndicate, proving that the claims were fraudulent. Glavis confronted Ballinger about the deception, ultimately persuading him to withdraw the patents. In the end, it was determined that the Cunningham claims had been vastly overvalued. The promised bonanza of coal was a mirage. But by then, Ballinger had done enough to establish his worth to the Guggenheims as a stalwart friend of their business concerns. When Robert Taft succeeded Teddy Roosevelt as president in March 1909, he named Richard Ballinger as his Secretary of the Interior. As Taft was rounding out the rest of his appointees, Ballinger recommended to his new boss a diplomat named Henry Lane Wilson as the United States' new ambassador to Mexico. Ambassador Wilson was a man who, like Ballinger, understood his assignment. When Francisco Madero assumed office in November 1911, he began immediately undermining the new Presidente in dispatches to President Taft and Secretary of State Philander Knox. In one cable, Wilson wrote, "The President's attention should be called to the growing anti-American spirit of the Madero administration, which shows not only a decided preference for European markets, but which is discriminating against American interests." To Secretary Knox, he complained that the Madero government, quote, "while nominally pro-American, is really conducting a campaign against American interests. I foresee confiscation, harassment, and dislodgements of many of our important interests unless this government is taught in due season that every American interest in Mexico must receive the same measure of justice a Mexican interest in America would receive." At the same time, the ambassador buried the Mexican president in nuisance claims for damages incurred by American property holders during the rebellion against Porfirio Diaz, using Madero's bewilderment at and delay in satisfying these claims as evidence of the kind of anti-American uncooperativeness he'd been reporting to his superiors. Within a year, 20,000 U.S. troops had been sent to San Antonio to accomplish no military objective any greater than conveying to the Mexican population that their president had lost America's trust. Mexican and European capitalists in Mexico began to speculate about who, if not Madero, they really wanted to be doing business with. In March 1912, Pascual Orozco, who headed Madero's militia in the state of Chihuahua, launched a revolt against Madero. The revolt was easily put down by General Huerta, who came out of retirement to help preserve the regime, but even in victory, Madero was weakened further. Less than a year later, on February 9, 1913, in the closing days of President Taft's administration, a conspiracy of 8 plotters led by Porfirio Diaz's nephew, General Felix Diaz, made a second coup attempt. When the conspirators invited General Huerta to join them, he initially declined, sensing his position was about to improve, as it soon did when Henry Lane Wilson assured him that while the United States wasn't that bullish on Felix Diaz, they would be happy to back a Victoriano Huerta presidency. General Huerta worked overtly to put down the Felix Diaz coup, while covertly weakening Madero's military position with delay and misdirection. On February 18th, Madero and his vice president, Pino Suarez, were seized and jailed by Huerta's soldiers. The finer details of Huerta's succession were planned in Ambassador Wilson's rooms at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. On February 20th, Francisco Madero officially stepped down, having been promised that he and Suarez would be safely exiled. Under Mexican law, the line of succession fell to the Minister of Foreign Relations, who appointed Victoriano Huerta as his interior minister, then promptly resigned, conferring on Huerta a formally legal status as Mexico's rightful president. 2 days later, Madero and Suarez were shot by federal police on the pretext that they had been trying to escape. Such was the relationship with Mexico that Woodrow Wilson inherited from President Taft when he assumed office on March 4, 1913. As one contemporary writer put it, it was a situation, quote, loaded with a high explosive charge. American business interests with hungry eyes fixed on Mexican rubber, mining, oil, and railroads were optimistic about the new Huerta regime, especially if Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson could be kept on as local fixer. But as an unelected usurper, Huerta did not fit well with Woodrow Wilson's vision of liberal internationalism. The American president was not inclined to grant formal recognition to Madero's murderer, despite being aggressively petitioned by Ambassador Wilson to do so. President Wilson cited a Central American Peace Convention of 1907, which prohibited recognition of any government that seized power in a coup until they legitimated their position by winning a democratic election. President Wilson also noted that Huerta's occupation of Chapultepec Castle, the national palace in Mexico City, was contested by Emiliano Zapata in the south and by Pancho Villa and Venustiano Carranza in the north. Official U.S. policy held that no unelected government could be considered legitimate, while so much of the country was in open rebellion. Henry Lane Wilson was recalled in July 1913. In mid-August, right around the time that Gerald Lippiatt was killed by Baldwin Felt's men on Commercial Street in Trinidad, Colorado, Wilson sent an envoy to President Huerta advising him to appoint an interim president, announce new elections, step down, and, most importantly, decline to appear on the ballot when the new elections were held. But Huerta politely declined the request to step down. Instead, he dissolved Congress and announced new elections for October 26, 1913, the same date on which Governor Ammons would later order the Colorado National Guard into the strike zone. The elections proved a sham, with most ballots manufactured by the military, whose ranks had recently been supplemented with hundreds of thousands of forced conscripts taken from prisons and hospitals. His gambit having fallen flat, Woodrow Wilson announced in his State of the Union address of December 2nd that he was lifting the arms embargo on Mexico, allowing Venustiano Carranza's constitutionalists in northern Mexico to strengthen their military position. By this time, Carranza had allied with Pancho Villa, who brought his famed Army of the North into the constitutionalist fold. Throughout the fall and winter of 1913 and 1914, Villa's army won a series of battles against Huerta's federal forces across the central Mexican plateau, in Ciudad Juarez, Tierra Blanca, and Ojinaga. On April 2nd, Villa took Torreon, 700 miles from Mexico City, and the Constitutionalists began a siege of the port city of Tampico. Tampico lies in the oil-rich Tampico-Mislanta Basin and was, at the time, the largest oil-exporting port in the Western Hemisphere. Accordingly, ships from the U.S. Atlantic Fleet were stationed at the port and at nearby Veracruz to protect wells and refineries and the American workers and their families who serviced them. On April 6, 1914, when Constitutionalist forces clashed with the Mexican federal troops near refineries on the Panuco River, several Americans were evacuated to U.S. naval vessels. Additional waves of evacuations followed like aftershocks on the 7th and 8th. It was in this context that the USS Dolphin sent a whaleboat ashore to collect Max Tiron's gasoline. Tiron's warehouse was about 100 miles from Iturbide Bridge, which spanned a canal connecting the Panuco River to a lagoon north of the city. The railroad crossing this bridge was the main route to the north where the rebels were expected to launch their assault from, and was therefore being patrolled by a detachment of very jumpy soldiers who interpreted the American sailors' routine fuel run as something much more sinister. Almost immediately on putting ashore, the American soldiers were arrested by a unit of Mexican federal soldiers and taken to the headquarters of Colonel Ramon Hinojosa, where they were briefly questioned before being released back to the warehouse to finish loading their fuel, with instructions not to leave until Hinojosa had gotten clearance to release them from the garrison commander, General Morelos Zaragoza. The whole incident took less than an hour. After the sailors returned to the Dolphin, the gunship captain Ralph Earl visited Morelos Zaragoza, accompanied by the American consul in Tampico, Clarence Miller. Together, the three men quickly concluded that the mishap had arisen because Colonel Hinojosa was something of a rustic, not very well versed in the laws of war and the protocols of friendly nations. The matter appeared to be closed. But when the full story was conveyed to the Fleet Division Commander, Admiral Henry T. Mayo, the breach of military protocol took on a more urgent register, focused particularly on the fact that 2 of the soldiers had been removed from the whaleboat at gunpoint, which the Navy considered, at least technically, equivalent to an attack on U.S. soil. Channeling the narcissistic rage that all hegemonic powers must unleash on any subordination or slight, Mayo demanded severe punishment of the arresting officer, a written apology from General Morelos Zaragoza, and stipulated that within 24 hours the general must, quote, hoist an American flag in a prominent position on shore and salute it with 21 guns. Morelos Zaragoza satisfied most of Admiral Mayo's demand promptly, placing Colonel Hinojosa under arrest and humbly accepting all responsibility for the incident, but the 21-gun salute struck Morelos Zaragoza as above his pay grade. He would need to clear that one with the Mexican Ministry of War in Mexico City. When news of the affair made it to the Mexican capital, President Huerta met with Henry Lane Wilson's new replacement, American chargé d'affaires Nelson O'Shaughnessy, to express his hope that the matter was settled and that Mayo would withdraw his ultimatum for the Mexicans to publicly salute the American flag. The 24-hour deadline passed without response. Having heard nothing from Washington to imply that his ultimatum had been overruled, Admiral Mayo began maneuvering ships around Tampico and Veracruz to prepare for the consequences of spurning his demand. On Monday, April 13th, Woodrow Wilson addressed the media, assuring them, quote, the salute will be fired. On April 14th, the State Department attorney reported to Wilson that his research had unearthed an obscure precedent for attacking a foreign country over a slight to American honor without needing congressional approval. In 1854, the United States had shelled San Juan del Norte in Nicaragua in retribution for an insult to the American consul there. Wilson ordered the full Atlantic Fleet into Mexican waters. Meanwhile, O'Shaughnessy continued to try to wear down President Huerta's resolve until it finally dawned on him that Huerta actually wanted the U.S. to invade. As O'Shaughnessy would tell the Mexican Foreign Secretary, I can see only one reason for Huerta's refusal of our demand, that the cause of his government was lost and that foreign intervention was the only fair expectation that could save Mexico from anarchy. It was widely understood that with three of Carranza's armies bearing down from the north, the Huerta presidency could not be preserved by military victory. Only a political victory could save it now, and a showdown with the United States was probably Huerta's best chance to win one of those. On April 15th, Woodrow Wilson informed ranking members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of his intention to seize Tampico and Veracruz and blockade the coast of Mexico until American honor was satisfied. A final round of telegrams were exchanged on April 18th, with Wilson issuing a new ultimatum to be fulfilled no later than 6 p.m. the following day, a full 10 days after Admiral Mayo's original 24-hour ultimatum. Wilson spent the weekend at Sulphur Springs preparing his address to Congress to be delivered on Monday, April 20th. Meanwhile, Admiral Mayo finalized the details of the now imminent assault on Tampico. His fleet had been augmented by the troopship Hancock, carrying 1,000 Marines, among them Major Smedley Butler, who would later become famous after retiring with the rank of Major General for the 1935 anti-war pamphlet War is a Racket, based on his military experiences in Mexico, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, and China. I was a gangster for capitalism, Butler would write, going into extensive detail on just how lucrative American military adventures had been for barons of steel, nickel, copper, sugar, livestock, coal, cotton, petroleum, aviation, and of course, munitions. On Monday, April 20th at 2 p.m., President Wilson radioed orders to Admiral Mayo to land his ships at, not Tampico after all, but Veracruz, 200 nautical miles to the south, Mexico's main port and oldest city. The change was attributed to an emerging development. An American meatpacking baron friendly to the Huerta government, John Wesley Decay, known locally as the Sausage King of Mexico, had arranged for a shipment of arms to be sent from Europe on the German steamer Ipiranga. Wilson's orders to the Navy were to seize the customs house in Veracruz and prevent the weapons from being brought ashore. There was already a small fleet stationed at Veracruz under the command of Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher, and while Fletcher preferred to wait for Mayo's fleet to arrive, as well as a large flotilla that was still on its way to Mexico, the Ipiranga was scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m. local time, and there were signs that a gale was approaching from the north. So in an excess of caution, a landing party was assembled from the ships already anchored at Veracruz, a force of nearly 800 soldiers and Marines, to occupy the port. The port commander, General Gustavo Mas, was given orders by Mexico City to retreat to Tejeria, a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, rather than resist the obviously superior American force. But before these orders came in, Mas had already sent men from the 18th and 19th regiments to the docks to repel the landing, and had hundreds of Mauser and Winchester rifles distributed to the civilian population and to convicts in a military prison, La Galera. The invasion that all sides hoped would be bloodless and largely symbolic quickly descended into bloody, block-by-block, urban warfare. When the invasion was over, by late morning on April 22nd, the American troops occupied not just the port, but the entire city of Veracruz, with a landing expedition of 6,000. The Americans had lost 19 fighters, the Mexicans unknown hundreds, many of whose bodies were soaked in kerosene by the invaders when no one came to claim them, and burned in large piles. Meanwhile, in Colorado, on Wednesday, April 22, 1914, the United Mine Workers' Call to Arms was being drafted by strike leaders in Trinidad, a desperate plea for anyone and everyone across the state who supported the workers' cause to send guns and ammunition and, if possible, warm bodies to wield them. But several hundred striking miners now based in the Black Hills, 10 miles northeast of Ludlow, weren't bothering to wait for reinforcements. That day, 160 strikers mounted an armed attack on the Delagua and Hastings mines in Delagua Canyon. They were not able to capture either property, but in the attempt they killed 2 guards and 3 militiamen and left the mines in flames. On the same day, 500 strikers attacked the Empire Mine on the outskirts of Aguilar, north of Ludlow, driving 35 mine employees and their families, including mine president J.W. Sipple, into the refuge of the mine. The adult men among them were kept barricaded in the mine while the strikers burned the structures above ground, then slipped away, leaving the grounds in ruins. Small companies of strikers also attacked the Southwestern, Green, Royal, Canyon, and Broadhead mines in the area around Aguilar. All told, the day's offensives caused property damage of $200,000 from fire and dynamite, roughly $6 million in 2025 dollars. Los Animas County Sheriff James Grisham sent telegrams to Governor Ammons and Colorado Congressman Edward Taylor, quote, "Strike situation absolutely beyond control. Life and property in jeopardy. Sheriff's office and local police entirely helpless." CF&I Chairman Jesse Wellborn also telegrammed Ammons, who was making his way back to Colorado by train from Washington, D.C., to convey that CF&I was getting close to having to shut down their entire coal and steel operation in southern Colorado. Reports from company spies seem to confirm that these attacks were not entirely haphazard. What was needed to preserve peace, it was almost universally agreed, was federal troops, and the strikers believed, not unrealistically, that the unfolding war in Mexico would distract President Wilson from ordering troops in. So the tent colonists and refugees from Ludlow were still on their own for the time being. The more militant strikers felt that they had the numbers to overwhelm the militia and the mine guards with well-planned and executed guerrilla tactics. There was also a reasonable expectation that unions across the country would answer the call to arms and support the Colorado strikers with men and materiel. Already 30 armed Greeks had made the trip across the Raton Pass from New Mexico. The Denver Typographical Union had donated $500 for guns and ammo, and armed companies were reportedly being assembled across the Southwest. At United Mine Workers headquarters in Indianapolis, a letter in Italian from Johnson City, Illinois was received that read, quote, 300 Italians of this place are ready at any time to leave for Colorado to defend their brothers against the murderous attacks. Our blood is boiling, and we are ready to sacrifice our lives for this just cause. Adjutant General Chase scrambled to put together a militia force to supplement the skeleton crews in Ludlow and Trinidad. He promised the mine operators 600 guardsmen, but the Colorado National Guard was effectively in open mutiny at the time over back pay. Some companies sent as few as 5 men. Some refused to report altogether until they were paid. Ultimately, Chase was able to assemble just over 300 soldiers, who he brought down from Denver by train. On Thursday, April 23rd, a force of strikers of roughly the same size marched on Trinidad and drove out the militia stationed there, turning the camp at Mount St. Raphael Hospital into their own military headquarters, which they named Camp Bashower, after the Trinidad physician who had treated their wounded at the Battle of Ludlow. That same day, the first of several funerals was held in Trinidad, with 1,500 mourners forming a procession behind the caskets of the women and children who died beneath the tents. 11 white coffins for the children, and 3 black coffins for the women, leading the procession in 2 horse-drawn dray carts. When 5,000 miners in Wyoming announced that they were armed and coming to join the encampment, Union Attorney Horace Hopkins offered to keep them out and enforce a full cessation of hostilities if the militia would agree to the same. The truce took effect at midnight on Friday, April 24th, just as the first troop transport train pulled into Ludlow with 262 militiamen aboard. The Union was able to get the truce to hold in the southern field, but by now the unrest was no longer contained to just the south. On Saturday, April 25th, several hundred miners in Fremont County mounted a sustained attack on the Victor American mine at Chandler, near Canyon City, about 100 miles south of Denver. By Sunday the 26th, the attackers, now numbering an estimated 1,000 men, were able to overwhelm the mine's machine gun defenses and capture the mine, sabotaging its equipment and looting anything of value they could lay hands on. The truce was effectively shattered by this attack, and with still no commitment from President Wilson to send in federal troops, new fighting broke out near Walsenburg, first at the McNally mine, where attackers drove out the guards and set the premises on fire, before moving to the larger Walsen mine. When news of this attack reached Trinidad, several hundred strikers from Camp Bashower marched up to join them. As with the attacks earlier that week, these moves were not as spontaneous as they appeared. Strikers at Camp Bashower were organized into battalions of a few hundred men each, and command was given to those who had the most prior military experience. Arms and ammunition were lifted from company stores. A 20-man brigade captured a locomotive at El Moro, near Trinidad, and ran it to Ludlow to convey troops and weapons to the strikers still camped in the Black Hills. While the strikers in Trinidad marched north to join the battle in Walsenburg, hardware merchant E.L. Neely was delivering a shipment of arms and ammo to a makeshift arsenal near the Toltec mine, a stone house just outside of Walsenburg, on the far side of a 3-mile ridge known locally as the Hogback. According to at least one report, the battle plan was to culminate in the dynamiting of Sheriff Jefferson Farr's office in Walsenburg. An informant known only by the palindrome Simic reported to Governor Emmons that the truce was really just a ruse to buy time to muster more men, ammo, and weapons. Judging by the talk around headquarters, he wrote in an April 25th communique, "The worst is yet to come in the southern field."
See, we had the fellow by name, he was killed in Mexico, Don McGregor, wonderful fellow. I used to tell poor old Don, I said, "Don, get down, you're going to get hit." Bullets would be hitting around. Don was one of the bravest guy and the straightest guy of all the newspaper. Of course, those reporters of the newspapers, a lot of guys that were good, honest guys, but Don was the guy that, he used to, when he'd take a lot of those pictures and get out there, and he'd get himself a bottle and get down to the desk and start to write, take a shot, and then, boy, when he write the story, really was a good story.
You remember a newspaper reporter who came down here from Denver? His name was Don McGregor.
I don't know McGregor. I know McGregor that was the boss in Cedar Hill. That's about all I know. You know him too, McGregor.
In 1903, the manager of the Bon Marché, a department store in Seattle, Washington, asked E.F. Chase, the business manager of the Seattle Star, to grant the Bon Marché censorship rights over any articles in the Star that might paint the store in a bad light, particularly if those articles publicized the details of any lawsuits the store was trying to keep quiet. Mr. Chase refused, and the Bon Marché pulled its advertising from the paper in protest. Chase was contrite when he approached the paper's owner, newspaper mogul E.W. Scripps, to tell him about the lost ad revenue, but Scripps took the news in stride, telling his business manager, "I wish to congratulate you. The big advertiser is invariably a bully to the local newspaper." This was a sentiment he would repeat in various forms over the years. "The whole editorial staff of every modern newspaper is little more than an auxiliary of the advertising department," he once remarked. "I recognize the advertiser as the enemy of the newspaper." Scripps employed several strategies to keep advertiser influence muted. He kept his papers small. 4 pages was typical, with the more successful papers running to 8 pages, which lowered production costs enough that the money from subscriptions alone would cover most of the operating expenses. Editors were given a share of the profits to incentivize them to grow circulation. Space for ads was kept to a minimum, and this scarcity let Scripps charge more per inch, further reducing the need for high ad volume. But no matter how few ads Scripps papers managed to run, their editors were still continually exposed to the jeopardy of advertiser boycotts and subsequent loss of revenue. In 1905, the Postum Cereal Company, maker of grape nuts and Post Toasties, pulled its cereal ads when the Cincinnati Post, no relation, refused to run an ad attacking labor unions alongside the ones selling cereal. A year later, Owl Drugstores pulled its ads for similar reasons. Theater owners in Ohio withdrew their ads after failing to cajole the Cincinnati Post and Cleveland Press into giving their plays better reviews. Department chains pulled ads after Scripps papers reported on safety violations in their stores. In this era, in the age of the iconic newspaper barons Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, E.W. Scripps was atypical in wanting not only to sell paper to the masses, but also to publish stories in them that at least passingly acknowledged their class interests. In 1889, when the Scripps newspaper chain, then numbering only 4 papers, sent a delegation to the Paris International Exposition, it invited labor leaders Samuel Gompers and Terence Powderly to help select the delegates. The delegation was dubbed the Working Man's Expedition, and their travels across Europe as representatives of American dressmakers, ironworkers, meatpackers, and railroad mechanics was widely reported on in Scripps papers. On the one hand, this was just good business. As Scripps put it to one of his editors, the wage-earning class is by far the largest purchasing class. But that's not to say it was a racket. Mogul though he was, Scripps seems to have been sincerely committed to this project on principle as well. His papers consistently championed higher wages, expansion of public services like libraries, streetcars, municipal utilities, sanitation, and decried exploitation of workers, particularly child laborers. As early as 1904, Scripps was convinced that getting rid of advertising altogether would be the most effective route to winning over working-class subscribers by keeping papers cheap and focusing on stories that workers wanted to read. His non-advertising newspaper scheme, as he called it, envisioned a chain of completely ad-free newspapers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Baltimore, and Chicago. Chicago was ultimately chosen for the test market, and in 1911, Daybook was launched, a 32-page, penny-an-issue mini tabloid you could hold in one hand on a crowded L train. Ben Hecht, who was making a name for himself as a Chicago journalist at this time, would later write about Daybook that, quote, "It was no bigger than a railroad timetable and could fit in your handkerchief pocket without folding." Carl Sandburg, not yet well known for his poetry, took a job as a reporter at Daybook in 1913, and had worked his way up to senior editor by the time the paper folded in 1917. Among the selections in Sandberg's second collection of poems, 1918's Cornhuskers, can be found an elegy called Memoir of a Proud Boy, recounting the 1916 killing of his friend and daybook colleague Don McGregor in Chihuahua, Mexico. 3 riders emptied lead into him, Sandberg wrote. He lay on the main street of an inland town. A boy sat near all day, throwing stones to keep the pigs away. Ben Hecht was kind enough to mention McGregor in his memoir, A Child of the Century, and while he misremembered Don's first name as Dan, he made up for it by leaving us one of the few visual images we have of the man, describing McGregor as, quote, a lanky, rumple-haired Scot with a long-nosed jester's face. Born in Scotland, McGregor came to San Francisco shortly after he graduated from the University of Edinburgh, McGregor being one of the few actual college boys in our story to fight alongside the tent colonists rather than against them. He took work as a journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle in 1908 and was in Chicago by 1912 when his tenure at Daybook began. McGregor wrote copiously for that paper and was quickly promoted to city editor, but his penchant for drink and his inclination to ill health were disruptive enough that within a year, his editor, Negley Cochran, sent him to Colorado where he hoped the mountain air would be restorative. By mid-1913, McGregor was writing for another Scripps paper, the Denver Express. In September of that year, he was the only journalist to make the trip to Berwind Canyon when the newly struck miners and their families made their trek down the canyons to the tent colonies. Every wagon was the same, he reported, with its high-piled furniture and its bewildered woebegone family perched atop, and the furniture, little piles of miserable-looking straw bedding, little piles of kitchen utensils, all so worn and badly used they would have been the scorn of any second-hand dealer on Larimer Street. From testimony he would later make to the Congressional Committee on Mines and Mining, which investigated the Colorado strike in February 1913, we learn that McGregor remained in the coalfield after filing this report, joining a few other reporters and photographers from the Rocky Mountain News to investigate the killing of Marshal Bob Lee, though their efforts were ultimately thwarted by mine guards. Tantalizingly, during his testimony, just as McGregor was about to reveal what little he did know about the murder, he was cut off mid-sentence. It was impossible to find out anything as to the exact manner in which Bob Lee was killed, the transcript quotes McGregor as saying. The only thing we could find out was, and here the attorney for CF&I cut him off, asking, is it a good idea to take up time with these inquiries about a specific matter of killing? The Union counsel questioning McGregor agreed to let it go and advanced to the next question. In the autumn of 1913, McGregor shuttled between Trinidad and Denver, making periodic visits to the strike zone. On October 19th, he visited the Forbes colony in the aftermath of the Death Special shoot-up that killed Luca Varnick and maimed Marco Zamboni. On the 22nd, he went to Dawson, New Mexico to cover a mine disaster there, returning to Ludlow on October 26th, just as tensions with the mine guards were about to prompt the governor to order in the guard. By this point, McGregor had been joined by a newsreel cameraman named Victor Milner, who would find acclaim in Hollywood 20 years later as the cinematographer on pictures by Ernst Lubitsch, Preston Sturgis, King Vidor, and Cecil B. DeMille. Milner relates that when he arrived at his hotel in Trinidad, he was immediately paid a visit by the county sheriff James Grisham, who told him that his camera had better not leave his hotel room if he knew it was good for him. But with the help of some miners he met in a bar that evening, Milner was able to smuggle out his equipment and make the trip north to Ludlow in time to shoot footage of the skirmishing that greeted Carl Linderfelt when he arrived in the strike zone on October 27th, and of the assaults on the Berwind and Tabasco mines on October 28th. Milner intended the footage to be included in a newsreel for the Pathé News Service, but first he had to get it out of Las Animas County, which by his own account he barely managed to do. If my Model T hadn't been a bit faster than theirs, I would have been buried in Trinidad, he later wrote. The film was ultimately confiscated by the Colorado Attorney General as evidence, and for decades it was assumed to be lost, but you can view this footage today on YouTube as part of Pathé Weekly number 65. A little over a month later, with winter settling into the Rockies, Don McGregor checked into the Troutdale in the Pines Hotel, a mountain resort west of Denver, where, As he told Carl Sandburg in a letter the following March, he went to recover from maladies both physical and mental. "There were days when I did not care if the heavens fell or the earth dissolved," he told Sandburg. McGregor spent the rest of the winter at Troutdale in the Pines, leaving only to respond to his summons to appear before the Committee on Mines and Mining in February. By mid-March, his cabin fever seems to have leapt out of his body to inhabit the natural world around him. "I spent a week tramping in the mountains," he wrote Sandburg, "trying to convince myself to stay loafing for another month or two, but the mountains were as bad as the world below. Everything is working here. Trees and shrubs and plants and grass and the very earth itself are full of movement." He told Sandburg that he had written Negley Cochrane in Chicago to see if he would have him back at Daybook, and that, should he decline, he had no idea what to do with himself. "I feel spring mad enough to do anything," he wrote. On April 1st, 1914, McGregor returned to Denver to find himself a pariah. Having gone into sudden seclusion in the mountains so soon on the heels of telling his editor at the Denver Express about his rifle-toting in the Ludlow tent colony, seems to have given his newspaper colleagues all the time they needed to replace the man they knew with a mythic figure they barely recognized and weren't sure they liked. At the Denver Press Club, he was scorned as a radical anarchist. The Express would not have him back, nor the Denver Post, nor the Rocky Mountain News, and by mid-month he still had not heard any word back from Negley Cochrane at Chicago Daybook. So when news of the Ludlow massacre reached McGregor on April 21st, it was not under the employ of any news organization that he returned to the coalfield, but as something closer to the guerrilla fighter his journalistic comrades imagined him to be transforming into. On April 29th, when National Guard Colonel Edward Verdeckberg arrived in Walsenburg from Ludlow with 132 guardsmen to protect whatever might be left of the Walsen mine, he found the strikers well fortified along the Hogback, fighting under the command of their new general, Donald McGregor of Edinburgh, Scotland, journalist. The men on the Hogback had between 150 and 200 rifles and even some small improvised mortars, but it was primarily their command of the high ground that allowed them to hold the entire 3-mile ridge against the local mine guards' multiple attempts to dislodge them. The guards were fortressed behind a smaller ridge near Watertank Hill in Walsenburg, southeast of the Hogback, which, like the hill of that name in Ludlow, provided good visibility of the terrain, which here included both Hogback Ridge and the Walsen mine. Verdeckberg took a detachment of militia to hold Watertank Hill and another patch of high ground called Capitol Hill near the Walsenburg courthouse, from each of which he would mount his assault on the Hogback. This assault, led by a Lieutenant Scott, seemed to be making solid progress when they came upon a line of strikers concealed in the bush and behind rocks, who were able to quickly drive them into retreat. The guardsmen took 4 casualties in the retreat, 1 fatal. Major Pliny Lester, a medic who was treating one of the other wounded guardsmen when he took fire to the chest. Meanwhile, Horace Hawkins was frantically working the phones trying to reinstate the truce. President Wilson had finally agreed to order federal troops into Colorado, and the Union wanted them to arrive into a pacified strike zone. General Chase was willing to grant the truce, given Verdeckberg's failure to drive the strikers from the Hogback. A ceasefire was called for 2 p.m., but McGregor was not able to immediately persuade the strikers on the Hogback to stop fighting, no doubt in part because he lacked any past experience as a military commander or as a coal miner. More militia assaults were attempted, but like the early efforts, they ended in retreat under fire. One captain reported to Verdeckberg, after his unit took striker fire from rifle pits on the Pueblo Road south of the Hogback, quote, "Need reinforcements. Ought to have artillery." By 8 p.m., McGregor had managed to get messengers to all the fighters on the Hogback to convey that the truce was on. The next morning at 10 a.m., McGregor met with Colonel Verdeckberg to negotiate an exchange of men as protection while each side gathered their dead. Verdeckberg prodded McGregor about the strikers handing over their arms, which was one of the negotiated truce conditions. McGregor responded that U.S. troops would be arriving in just a few hours. Why don't you leave the disarming to them? And Verdeckberg agreed. That afternoon at 4:15, the first troop transport rolled in from Fort Leavenworth, carrying 350 soldiers from the 5th Cavalry. By then, all the strikers on the Hogback had melted away. At the time of his death in March 1916, Don McGregor had been in Mexico for over a year. He'd long since fled Colorado after being indicted in May 1914 for the murder of Major Lester. In Mexico, McGregor had taken up journalism again, sending out dispatches to be published in American workers' newspapers and socialist magazines. His last piece, a polemic against U.S. intervention in the Mexican Revolution, was the lead article in the April 1916 edition of the International Socialist Review, which ran it complete with McGregor's covering note complaining of the difficulty of slipping his pieces past the Mexican censors. Quote, "This is my third attempt to get some stuff through to the review, and the good God alone knows if this will get out of the country. It is strictly against the law down here to send out articles uncensored. I'd as soon lose my right arm as allow these fellows here to censor my stuff. I believe I am spotted anyway. The penalty if caught is instant deportation at the nearest port of entry or the firing squad. I have no firing squad ambitions." By the time the issue hit the stands, McGregor was already dead at the hands of Villista soldiers, though for reasons that probably had little to do with evading the censors. The killing happened in or near Guerrero, Mexico on March 28th, after Pancho Villa, who was now in rebellion against the Carranza government, which succeeded Huerta's rule, captured the garrison there. Carl Sandburg's verse account of Don McGregor's death comes from a report given to military authorities by a man named J.H. Locke, who himself had fled when Villa's troops attacked. Both McGregor and another man, a German mine owner named Hermann Blankenberg, were still among the living when Locke escaped, but he hired a local farmer to find out what happened after he left. And it's from this informant we get the story about McGregor and Blankenberg's demise, in a bandit action by Villa's men, running rampage through the town, very likely at Villa's direction. The colorful detail about the pigs kept away from the corpses by a boy throwing stones comes from the same source. An earlier report, though, attributes McGregor's killing not to spontaneous banditry, but to formal execution. In the April 1st edition of the Chicago Examiner, H.H. Stansberry of the International News Service reported from El Paso that Pancho Villa personally ordered the execution by firing squad of McGregor and Blankenberg, as well as 5 American civilians. McGregor had been discovered in hiding with a doctor named A.T. Stell, Stanberry reports, when, quote, Villa ordered them dragged out, stripped of clothing, hanged, and shot. Just 3 months earlier, McGregor had interviewed Pancho Villa for the newspaper Enterprise Association. Villa had just been defeated by the Carrancistas, decisively it appeared at the time, and was preparing to take refuge in the mountains of Chihuahua. "The owls of the mountains have their crevices," Villa told a crowd of his supporters. "Surely God will not deny me any less." To McGregor's readers he boasted, "I have many cartridges yet, but I will not use them against my fellow Mexicans. The Carrancistas are the advance guard of the gringos. The gringos, lusting for the gold and riches of this great country, will follow them, and when they do, I will be ready. I will find use for the cartridges I will not use against my countrymen." This newfound patriotism was essentially a public relations effort. In late 1915, Pancho Villa still had 4 years of guerrilla war ahead of him in northern Mexico, mostly directed toward the Carrancistas, not the Americans. But his intention to kill gringos was not an empty threat. Throughout the winter of 1916, Villa's raiders murdered dozens of foreign employees in mining towns across Chihuahua and Durango. In late March, it hardly would have mattered that Don McGregor spoke with the Scottish burr or carried a British passport. American exceptionalism notwithstanding, gringo is not a synonym for Yankee. It simply means foreigner, employing the same rubric as our old familiar shibboleth, barbarian. The word likely descends from the Spanish griego, meaning Greek, a language that stood in 18th century Iberia for incomprehensibility. One can't help but wonder what insights might have descended into the human collective consciousness if Greeks of the 5th century BC, as they were crafting the notion of barbarianhood out of the raw experience of being flummoxed by strange speech, could have been shown a vision of their own countrymen 23 centuries later, poster children for the very same construct in Spain. There is another competing etymology for gringo that may also be worth mentioning in passing. In the language of the Spanish Roma, gringo is a contraction of peregringo, meaning wanderer or wayfarer, or perhaps, as we might say, bohemian. The arrival of U.S. troops in the strike zone offered the strikers and their families the first real prospect of physical safety and security they'd had in months. With the regular army now emplaced in the southern field, neither mine guards, nor marshals, nor Baldwin Felt detectives, nor sheriff's deputies could project the threat of terror they'd been brandishing since September. But the enforced peace cut both ways, delivering the decisive blow to the strike that for all their menace and violence, the guards and militia and gun thugs could not deliver. The Army's mandate in Colorado was to restore normalcy, and that meant getting the mines running at capacity, and that meant ramping back up the importation of strikebreakers. The tent colonies that remained in spring of 1914 held on through the summer and fall, largely in an exercise of pride, but it was clear by then that any chances of Union victory were vanishingly small. And in December 1914, the strike was ended by unanimous vote. In mid-May 1914, just after the arrival of federal troops in southern Colorado, the writer Upton Sinclair, upon his release from jail after setting up his morning pickets outside of John Rockefeller's office in Lower Manhattan, organized a publicity tour, including several of the women from the tent colonies, Pearl Jolly, Mary Thomas, Maggie Dominiski, and Mary Petrucci. The tour made stops in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and New York, speaking at rallies and giving press interviews, and ultimately getting an audience with Woodrow Wilson in the Oval Office. Along the way, Mary Petrucci gave this statement to a D.C. reporter. "Perhaps it seems strange to you that I want to go home, but I do. My man is there, and my children are buried there. I've been so happy there. Why, there wasn't a happier woman anywhere than I was. You see, I'm Italian, although I was born in this country, and our people are gay of heart. I used to sing around my work and playing with my babies. Well, I don't sing anymore, and my husband doesn't laugh as he used to. I'm 24 years old, and I suppose I'll live a long time, but I don't see how I can ever be happy again. But I try to be cheerful on account of my husband. It is so hard for him when he comes home from work only to find me in the house and none of the children. But you're not to think we could do any differently another time. We are working people, my husband and I, and we're stronger for the union than before the strike. I can't have my babies back, but perhaps when everybody knows about them, something will be done to make the world a better place for all babies." Effigy is written, produced, and read to you by Chris Schoen. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to help ensure it continues, the best way to do that is to share an episode with people you think might like it, or to post about it on social media. If you prefer to make a more anonymous impact, we will never begrudge a nice 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. You can also support the show by becoming a subscriber on Patreon at patreon.com/effigypod, EFFIGYPOD. If you're able to subscribe, you'll be making a difference in helping me make the show even more excellent and helping me spend more time doing what I would like to be doing with my time here on planet Earth. It doesn't cost much. Tiers start at just $3 a month, and even the lowest tiers include exclusive access to bonus material. You can write to the show at effigypod@gmail.com, and you are encouraged to do so. You can also follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky by searching for the handle effigypod. You can also find all the social media handles and get on our mailing list at the podcast website, effigypod.com, which also has show transcripts, a bibliography, and a very nice picture of mules. A couple of show notes. First, a correction. Way back in episode 1, I mistakenly gave the name of George Lippiati to the Union organizer killed by Belk and Belcher in Trinidad in August 1913. That was a nod on my part that I only just noticed. Lippiati's given name was Gerald, not George, and in fact his family name was Lippiat, not Lippiati. Some sources add the I at the end, perhaps on the presumption Gerald was of Italian heritage, and I followed that usage in the spirit of hopeful revisionism, but But as it happens, census records show Lippiot's English ancestry going back several centuries, with most of his male relatives for several generations being coal miners in Durham County in Northumbria. This has been the last regular episode of Season 1, so if you've been listening sequentially, thanks for sticking with us. If you haven't been listening sequentially, I admire your sense of adventure. Patreon subscribers can look forward to a couple of bonus episodes in the coming months. For everyone else, Season 2 is in the works, and you can get updates on that on our social media feeds, mailing list, or by becoming a Patreon supporter. Thank you very much for listening. Till next time, Bella ciao.